My name is Sandy Adamitis, the social media director for the Page International Screenwriting Awards, and your host for the Writers Hangout, a podcast that celebrates the many stages of writing, from inspiration to the first draft, revising, getting a project made, and everything in between. We'll talk to the best and the brightest in the entertainment industry and create a space where you can hang out, learn from the pros, and have fun. Hey writers, boy, do we have a terrific show for you today. Our guest is Professor Carol Stabile. She's here to talk about her book, The Broadcast 41. The Broadcast 41 delves into the experience of 41 remarkable women, including some of the most prominent figures of their time. Dorothy Parker, Gypsy Rose Lee, Lena Horne, and screenwriter Vera Caspray. These women with diverse backgrounds and ambitions challenged the rigid norms of the American television and radio industry during the 1950s Red Scare period. Carol is a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies and associate dean for strategic initiatives for the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Oregon. Along with Broadcast 41, Carol is the author of Feminism and the Technological Fix, White Victims, Black Victims, Gender, Race, and Crimes in the U.S. Culture. And if you love secrets about the FBI, you're going to love this interview. Let's get started. Carol, thanks so much for joining us on the Writers Hangout.
Thank you so much, Sandy, for hosting me on the Writers Hangout. I'm delighted to be here today.
You wrote the most wonderful book. I was scouring the internet and I came across it and my jaw dropped. I have never heard of Broadcast 41. Of course, I've heard of the Blacklist, but you found a mind to just keep digging and find the most interesting information. Can you tell us about Broadcast 41?
Yeah, thank you so much. I love the opportunity to talk about this group of women because they were really remarkable. So the Broadcast 41 is the phrase I use to describe a generation of women who are working in and around film, television, other media in the years between the two world wars. Many of them were at the top of their game in the 1940s. And as the United States headed into the post-war era, they had established writing careers. Some of them had very lucrative and successful careers as screenwriters in Hollywood. But the blacklist that happened in the late 1940s and early 1950s really put an end to many of their careers. We know a lot, or like I say, we historians know a lot about what happened in the post-war era to women working in industries and the ways in which, with returning GIs, they were pushed out of the workforce. Of course, there were some women who never left the workforce. That's important to keep in mind. But of a lot of these women, the blacklist, which was really about suppressing certain kinds of ideas in across media industries, really converged with that post-war push to make it very difficult for women to continue to do the work that they've been doing up until that time. And so I use the phrase the Broadcast 41, of course, playing on the Hollywood 10, who mostly get all the airtime, as a way of drawing attention to a generation of women who were ready to make a real difference in film and television in particular, and were prevented from doing so by the blacklist.
What was your inspiration behind writing Broadcast 41?
Oh, this book was so many years in the making. I first started thinking about it years and years ago. I hate to admit it was 30 years ago. I was working on a couple of other book projects, and I started thinking about the family values debates of the 1990s and thinking about the fact that I grew up in a family that didn't look like the families that were being promoted as the family ideal. And I knew a lot of other people who didn't grow up in those kinds of families, even though we were told that was the traditional American family.
Can you share what your family looked like?
Sure. I come from a big Italian family. I grew up in northern New Jersey, and my parents owned a Wild West theme park.
So, wait, say that again?
They owned a Wild West theme park. So I grew up in this weird kind of, the sort of hinterlands of the entertainment industry.
Did you get to wear fringe and cowboy boots?
Yeah.
Oh,
I was a cowboy until I was probably about 15.
how wonderful.
I guess that what really interested me, the question I kept coming back to is there was a sense that every time I looked at the images that were being promoted as a traditional American family, they wouldn't use images from politicians' own families. They would use images from 1950s sitcoms. And the more I dug into it, the more I thought, this is really interesting, right? The media industries using these images they created to say that this was a traditional family. And that got me
Yes.
thinking about who wrote those stories and what the conditions were in which those stories were produced. And that kind of led me directly to the blacklist because I started realizing again, there were these incredible women and incredible men who were really sort of pushing the envelope when it came to gender, when it came to representations of race, but all of that. And, I should add, even though my book doesn't do it justice, representations of immigration, all of that got shut down. I mean, it really became to raise those issues was to risk being smeared and to risk losing your job. I really feel like there's not enough that's been written about that because, there's a sense that after the 1950s, I mean, you did have these weird and kind of problematic scripts about Italian Americans, like Life with Luigi, and then the Irish, Life of Riley. But then the only representations you have of immigrants are these tropes of them as aliens, right? Like perfect
Yes.
strangers. You can't talk about immigrants in any kind of direct way until later on. And then it becomes primarily negative.
Rod Serling, such a talent, but walked away because he felt that he could not write the way he wanted about immigrants and problems in the world.
Right.
And he had to hide it in aliens and things like that.
Yeah, you had to use these metaphors. I think it's interesting, and this is just a sidebar, all those kind of fantastic sitcoms of the 1950s, like Bewitched and The Munsters, they seem to me to be really ways of talking about all the social changes that were happening, but in a way that would get by the censors, right?
A spoonful of sugar.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, there are numerous talented women on the list, including Lena Horne, Lillian Hellman, Hazel Scott, Dorothy Parker. For this interview, I kind of honed in on Vera Caspray. She's a writer of novels, plays, and screenplays and short stories. Her book, Laura, was adapted into a successful movie. Can we touch base on her life and the Harry Cohen story?
Vera Caspray is just a remarkable figure. She starts out during World War II and makes her way into media industries in ways that a lot of women did during the two world wars, right? She starts in advertising because there are positions in advertising because of wartime labor shortages. And she works her way up. She's very, very funny and very smart and very cynical about what she's doing. One of the things she does is a fictitious piano course taught by a made up Russian immigrant named Sergei Marinov. And Sergei Marinov sold these by mail piano lessons. And then she wrote really, really funny ad copy before she moves into writing for magazines and writing crime fiction. Her first novel is called The White Girl, and it's a novel about a young Black woman who passes as white in New York City.
Wow.
So she moves from Chicago, where she'd been working in advertising, to work for Bernard McFadden, who's this very, very strange sort of magazine mogul and fitness guru in the 1920s. And she really hits it big with Laura, which, as you pointed out, is her sort of detective fiction classic. But she also is known for writing these great novels about women working in advertising. So using her own life and her own experiences. And these are women who don't need men. They're women who are very independent. They're women who use birth control, who have abortions, who do all the things that women in their teens and 20s do. She writes this very funny novel called Bedelia. It's about a woman who's like men's perfect fantasy. She just stays at home. She caters to men's every desire. She's beautiful. She's submissive. But unbeknownst to the men, she's a serial killer, poisoning her husbands. So Caspray's doing all this really interesting work. She's working with other women in Hollywood, but also in New York. She doesn't like Hollywood very much, and that's a characteristic of these women. She had bad encounters with people like Harry Cohn.
Harry Cohen.
Oh, Harry Cohn. She'd had her challenges with Harry Cohn in the past because she was very protective of her own writing and of her own creative vision. She didn't like it when people got in the way of it. She didn't like it when men in particular told her how she should be representing women, because she understandably felt like she had a better sense of both female audiences and women characters than people like Harry Cohn had. And so he would go out of his way, this is according to her letters and memoir, just to humiliate her. The example that you're talking about is Harry Cohn said, everyone knows that people just want to see pictures that have horses and the C word in them. And he turned to her and said, "Isn't that right, Miss Caspray?" I mean, they made it clear where she stood.
I have been in those situations, and it's horrible.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing is, I think that because this generation was so erased from our cultural memory, we forget that there's a long history, right? We come at it as if these things suddenly popped up out of nowhere, as if women in the industry haven't been fighting against them from the very beginning.
Yes.
We've seen in recent cases with Weinstein and other people.
Yes. Oh, heartbreaking that Weinstein's case got overturned. I just had to scroll past and go, I'm going to pay attention to that later. I can't do it today.
I can't. Yeah.
I can't today. What was Laura about?
So Laura was about, based on Caspray's own experiences in the advertising industry. The novel was about a very, very successful woman advertising executive who gets involved in a murder case. So it's a kind of classic mistaken identity. And they think that she's the person who's been killed. I'm giving spoilers here too. Should I give spoilers?
Oh, sure.
It's almost 100 years old, so right? I think that there should be a shelf life for spoilers. The police come to the scene. They think it's Laura that's been murdered, and it turns out that it's not Laura. And then the case unfolds to understand, because Laura now is still at risk.
Right.
The detective narrative is about how they unravel the murder of the other woman and how they unravel the attack on Laura. And the novel was substantially different than the film, which was directed by Otto Preminger. Preminger actually had Caspray removed from writing the adaptation because they couldn't see eye to eye on how to represent Laura. Caspray said that he wanted to represent her as this cute career girl. And in the novel, she is the only person who is strong and has integrity and is really on top of things.
I'm not quite sure how many years Otto Preminger has been dead, but he still scares me.
I think with good reason. I mean, the other thing that Caspray knew is that he had a reputation for sleeping with his leading ladies, and that did not end well for the leading ladies. In those days, he was known as a serial philanderer. I think today we would probably have a different way of talking about it. Yeah.
Your book introduces the concept of Leave It to Beaver syndrome. Can you elaborate?
I came up with it one day, kind of half joking, because there's this thing in communications research called the third person effect. And the third person effect refers to the way in which people who study propaganda always say, or media effects, they say, there's this group of people who are really influenced by media. Women and children, people of color, but we are not influenced by it, right? So there's this assumption that there are these vulnerable groups who watch television or watch film and then go out and do whatever they've seen on the screen. Of course, again, the investigator, usually white, usually male, is not affected by this at all. And I started thinking, that's so interesting. And also, how could you not be influenced by this deluge of media about a particular kind of masculinity in the 1950s. If you grew up watching Westerns, right, or consuming any of the multimedia, articles, toys, and stuff that were about the FBI, how could you not be influenced by that?
Exactly.
We assume that generation of men who consumed all those images of masculinity, many of which were misogynistic, all of which excluded anyone but white people, how could they not be affected by that?
They're human beings.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have a plethora of wonderful phrases and words. I have listed them, and I know this is not a game show, and I have to promise myself not to spit the words out at you. We have all the time in the world. Can you define these words for the writers out there? The
Yeah,
red.
I'd love to. So the Red Scare actually refers to two periods in U.S. history. The first Red Scare is right after World War I, and it's known as the Palmer Raids. And this is where J. Edgar Hoover really cuts his teeth as a G-man. And the Palmer Raids go after labor activists, they go after socialists, they go after Jewish American radicals. And this is when Rosa Luxemburg gets deported, and a lot of these people wound up getting caught up in this scare about dissent and about socialism. The second Red Scare really happens at the end of World War II, although, there's this kind of undercurrent throughout the interwar period of anti-communism. But of course, we're allies with the Soviet Union. So during World War II, that kind of gets waived. So the Red Scare really focuses on this fear of communism and this fear of socialism, which was often an outsized kind of panic. Call it a moral panic, right? But the Communist Party was never more than, 70,000 people in the United States. But it did become this kind of demon that could get conjured at particular moments in time so that anti-communists and the kind of what would have been the radical right at that point in time could make arguments for quelling dissent. That's really what happened in the years that I'm interested in, is that the FBI, anti-communist organizations, veterans organizations, all of them linked arms to really go after New Deal Democrats, people involved in civil rights, people who are mobilizing for global peace. All of this was under the sort of blanket of communism.
Right. And a lot of the women, a lot of the people involved were fighting for civil rights. Women didn't always think of their rights.
Yeah. Yeah.
All just so interesting to me that you could go to a meeting about, can we start something to help our fellow fill in the blanks? And before you know it, you could lose your job. I know that's a very simplistic way to look at it, but it scares me.
It is scary. And it's scary in our moment too, because the way that the blacklist and the Red Scare worked was through networks of innuendo and gossip.
Yes.
And connections between people. I was just talking the other day to the son. His father was blacklisted in the 1940s. He was a composer.
Oh my goodness.
Right. So it didn't really matter whether you had any influence. And in reading the materials from the FBI, what's clear to me is that they knew that there was no communist threat. They knew that media industries hadn't been infiltrated, but they also realized how useful this was to really eliminate people who were critical, people who were innovative, who were thinking about social justice, and who were thinking about change.
Now, the second part of this is the FBI decided we're going to get rid of people, and now we're going to get our hands in it and actually create media. Was that happening at the same time? Was that two very separate moments?
No, and it's kind of funny to map it now. The FBI it was called the Crime Division, but the Crime Division was really a PR division. They called it the Crime Division, but its job was to network with friendly journalists and to produce media that was sympathetic to the FBI's point of view. So you had gangbusters, in the 1930s.
And that was a television series,
That
correct?
was a radio series first and then
Oh,
a television
radio.
series. Yeah. And then you had a film like G-Man. The problem was that it wasn't very interesting and that it was so formulaic that people in media were just like, okay, we can't do too much of this because it's really boring. And that wasn't something that Hoover wanted to hear in particular.
No. For the writers out there,
Oh, I'm talking about J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI.
next, double gated. I have never heard of that before.
Okay, so it's double GAITED, and it is
Oh,
a homophobic slur. So it's kind of like light in the loafers, which was another way of implying that someone wasn't heterosexual.
oh, it was gated as in the way you walk.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
now I get it.
yeah,
Got it. Got it. Got it.
yeah.
Signed membership card.
Yeah, this is an interesting story about Lucille Ball. So, if you were a member of the Communist Party, you signed a membership card. And the FBI got access to membership rolls and to sign membership cards. And more often than not, the Bureau would use confidential informants, and the confidential informants would say that they had seen a signed membership card. So, all that meant is that you had at one point been a registered member of the Communist Party, which Lucille Ball survived her blacklisting. That's a separate story, but they had found that she had signed a membership card.
Thinking back, do you think that was a flaw, having people sign membership cards?
I think a lot about the ways in which the Bureau put together evidence of Communist Party membership. And it included everything from signing a petition to showing up at a May Day parade in New York City, or even being mentioned favorably in the Communist Party's newspaper, the Daily Worker, right? Like that was enough to
Oh,
smear you. I think there was so much evidence that it really didn't matter that people had signed a card because the FBI was drawing from all these other sources anyway.
FBI's security index.
So the FBI has an index system that's used to track American citizens and others. The security index was a subset. It referred to people who were to be arrested or held in the event of a national emergency. The security index basically was people who were going to be rounded up.
Now, did the president know about this list?
That is a really
Wow.
good question. Yeah. I think that there were a lot of things that nobody wanted to know, so they didn't ask. And they gave the FBI great freedoms, and that includes Roosevelt as well.
Next one, American Business Consultants.
Oh, these were a group of former FBI agents who started their own private security firm. And they really were the people who initiated the smear and clear business in New York City. They stole files from the FBI to start their business. So J. Edgar Hoover was not particularly happy with them for a little while. But once it became clear that they were having an effect, he kind of backed off them. So they had this business and they published a newsletter called Counterattack. And in Counterattack, they would publish all manner of spurious information. They like to call it factual information. And I think if you've got to say factual before information, you know someone's lying. So what happened is they stole all these files, mostly on unions in New York City. And they would go to businesses, and the files were from the New York City Red Squad. And it listed people who they suspected of being communist. So they would go to employers with this list and say, well, I noticed so-and-so is, a member of the Communist Party or a fellow traveler. Do you want us to clear this person or to investigate them so that you can continue to hire them with a clear conscience? Some companies would play ball. It turns out that networks were not very happy about this to begin with. They didn't want, who were these guys anyway? And why
Yeah.
were they telling like Bill Paley that he shouldn't hire a wrangler?
Would have upset Slim.
Exactly. But they exercised an outsized influence. They published Red Channels, which was a report of communist influence in radio and television. They published it right at the beginning of the Korean War. That gave them a lot of leverage to really go after people in broadcasting that they deemed subversive. And it was a pretty expansive, as you can understand, their definition of subversive was pretty expansive.
It just amazes me as human beings that Seeing something in writing means so much to us. Once a lawyer told me, if it's written down, people just believe it.
That's right. And also keep in mind there were all these legislative hearings. There was the Tenney Committee in Hollywood, and they were calling people to testify. There was HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee in DC, and they had the power to subpoena. I mean, again, it's just what you said, Sandy, is once your name was listed, it didn't matter what you said after that. I think that there was someone who said it's like a bruise on an apple, right? Once you bruise an apple, the rest of it's no good.
Action detective formula.
That refers to the sort of preferred genre of the Law and Order crowd, right? The action detection formula, which was you had good guys, you had the bad guys. The good guys always prevailed at the end. The line between the protectors and the villains was always very, very clear and unambiguous.
So the FBI came up with that formula, or it was already a formula in the entertainment business? I was a little confused on that.
Yeah, that is a great question. And it is confusing because there's so much in the mix at that point in time. And the FBI is, putting out all these,
They're going to the
publications.
studios and basically pitching an idea and it gets made.
In some cases, yeah, but they're also pushing out all these books about G-Men and the FBI and peace and war, all of these narratives that, that present the Bureau and its agents as cultural heroes.
Which leads us to the G-Man.
The G-Man is an invention of the FBI. Hoover was very, very protective about the image of his agents. And if you look at the documents I've gotten through Freedom of Information Act requests, they have the applications that agents fill out to apply to the Bureau. And there are things like, they wanted to make sure that people weren't bald. You had to be a certain height. They preferred Protestants from the South. They wanted men who projected a particular kind of image of masculinity. I remember reading at one point, L.B. Nichols was his head of the crime unit division, which is the PR division. And he was Greek and darker skin. And someone said he always wore blue shirts because he was really worried that if he wore white shirts, it would make him look swarthier.
Oh my goodness. Counterattack.
Yeah, Counterattack was American Business's Consultants newsletter. And that's where a lot of people were originally named. And they did field a number of lawsuits because of that. Frederick March and his wife Florence successfully sued them. Other people sued them. But it was a way in which they could push forward gossip and smear people under the guise of, again, providing factual information.
Now, what did Counterattack have as distribution? Were they at newsstands?
No, that is such a good question. So you would subscribe to Counterattack, and that was one of the things when the American Business Consultants representatives would go to businesses, they would say, look, you need to subscribe to Counterattack so you can stay on top of, subversion and do the right thing. So they pushed those out. They also gave away copies of Red Channels. So all the networks, advertisers, sponsors got free copies of Red Channels. I can't even, I've been going through some new FBI files recently. I can't even tell you how many copies of Red Channels the FBI bought too, because they wanted their own copies for agents.
And if you put out a book and then your organization buys a whole bunch, does it help it make it look like your Counterattack was more popular than it was?
Oh, yeah. And of course, their partners in the American Legion and the VFW are buying copies and sharing them with the members. So they had a pretty wide network to distribute.
When I heard of the organizations that would distribute these, it kind of made me sad because they're the organizations of my childhood when you're, back east, all the...
Yeah.
In my time, they were just having a beer.
Yeah.
Blonde, communist, party girl.
So this is a trope that runs through a lot of the nonfiction writing as well as the FBI files themselves. There's always in the back of the picture this narrative about how the Communist Party is using white women, especially blonde party girls, to lure and deceive people into becoming members of the Communist Party. And this is especially true when they're talking about multiracial organizations. So it's also a deeply racist trope, right? Like, look at these
Yes.
people who are using white women to lure Black men. And they're pretty candid about saying that in a number of cases.
Judy Holliday, would she be considered a blonde Communist Party girl, or?
That's an interesting observation, because the thing about Judy Holliday, so first of all, she was brilliant. She was
Yes.
incredibly smart. She got her start in stand up in the Village, and she was involved with Stage for Action, which was another progressive theater organization. But when she was cast in films, she was almost always cast as a kind of dumb blonde. That was kind of true of her big role in Born
Oh,
Yesterday, right?
yes.
And so when she was blacklisted, it was right about the time that Born Yesterday was going to be released. And Garson Kanin, who was the writer on Born Yesterday, he was also married to Ruth Gordon. That's another great story. But so they were really worried about the impact of this on promotion of the film and on everyone's careers too.
In the movie, Judy's eyes are opened.
It's a take on the Pygmalion myth, right?
Got it. Great.
And it was also very critical of business. So she hires one of the founders of American Business Consultants, leaves, and founds his own agency in Hollywood to clear actors that he smeared in his other role. And so they hire Kenneth Byerly to help coach her so that she can clear her name. And she appears before the House Un-American Activities Committee. And basically the advice was, play the dumb blonde. If they get a sense of how smart you are and how subversive you are, you're done. And so when you read her testimony, you can see that she's playing that role is a strategy.
Is it easy to find on the internet, or can you send me her testimony?
I'm pretty sure I have a PDF of it. I'll send that to you.
I might post it somewhere in our socials.
Well, and I would suggest, if you're going to post that, you should post Hazel Scott's testimony before HUAC, because it is an example of bravery and conviction that's really important to see.
And can you let the writers know who Hazel Scott is?
Hazel Scott was a performer, child prodigy on the piano. Alicia Keys gave her a shout out a few years back. She was playing two pianos, and that was Hazel Scott's sort of signature act. So Hazel Scott was the first Black woman to have her own television show. She was actually the first African American to have their own television show. Her show aired early in 1950. And then she was blacklisted and the show was canceled. But before the show was canceled, she volunteered to go to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. And it's important to note that the House Un-American Activities Committee at that point is chaired by Richard Nixon. And it includes mainly white Southern segregationists.
That's a sweaty room.
So it is a sweaty, nasty room. And she went down there knowing, but also just wanting to register, like the Hollywood 10, her discomfort with these political proceedings. She was also married to Adam Clayton Powell Jr., first Black congressman from New York at that time. So she was also being targeted too, because both of them had been prominent in some high-profile civil rights cases.
It's not just that you're on a list and then you go along with your life. They oppressed you, and it could last for years. What did it look like for the actress Madeline Lee, who was also known for something a little unusual?
Her baby sounds?
Yes. Did you get to hear any recordings of her, or?
Yeah. You can find them on YouTube. So Madeline Lee Guilford was married to Jack Guilford. She had been a longtime socialist. I think she's a socialist since she was in high school. She was a committed union member. Going through her papers was just amazing. You got a sense of how compassionate these people were and how committed they were to seeing the world change for the better. She also did not take any of this lying down. She knew, for example, because she was a mom, she had two small children, I think, and after Red Channels was published, and she knew that she had been assigned FBI agents because they were always on the street corner watching her. She once went up to them and offered them coffee. And FBI would write in their reports things like, yeah, we were told to go watch Madeline Lee Guilford. We were there for like a week. Nothing happened. She didn't leave the apartment. Of course, she didn't leave the apartment. She had a baby, probably and a 2-year-old. Like, who leaves their apartment unless they have to at that point?
No elevator. She was up on the 8th floor.
You've got the picture. But they also sent people out to follow her when she went on vacation. So the one story I tell in the book, I think she's on Fire Island on vacation, and they send a server to serve her with a subpoena as she's trying to get her kids into the house. And I think what she did is she whacked the server with a magazine, basically said, get the hell out of here. But she and Jack, the blacklist affected these people's lifelong earnings. Again, if you were working on Broadway, you could still get work, but certainly it wasn't the kind of lucrative work that people were getting in television. Vera Caspray said she went from making $55,000 to making $2,000 a year in a period of 2 years.
Wow. You state this so beautifully in the book. Those that got pushed out, we don't have their voices.
Yeah. Yep.
And those were the people who were writing the more progressive things with people of color and women's point of view. And it wasn't male bashing. It was another point of view.
Yeah. Yeah. That's all it was.
How did you get off the blacklist?
Well, some people, Lena Horne, Judy Holliday, used clearance services, right? So they basically hired the people who'd been responsible for smearing them to clear them. And that was one way to get off the blacklist. The other way to get off the blacklist was to name other names. And there were many, many men, fewer women, I think, who gave the names, right? I mean, and you can read about that with a Hollywood 10 because, those writers, directors, and producers, they turned on each other. Look at Elia Kazan. When even though they said to themselves, well, I'm only naming people who've already been named before, and that was a strategy that some of them undertook to make themselves feel better, they were giving up other names as a way of saving their own skins. Next year will be the 75th year since Red Channels was published, and I've been working with some of the children of people who are blacklisted who want to have a kind of museum about the blacklist.
What a great idea.
Isn't that a great idea? And they also, we're talking about maybe doing a symposium next year because the children saw what happened to their parents. They saw how their parents suffered. Bringing together the children with people who are now writing books about some of the people who've been forgotten, with documentary makers who are trying to tell the stories of some of these women. And one of them said to me that years later, his father had run into another person and the other person had given up names and had said, well, I'm really sorry, but I had a career, I had a wife and had children. And the guy just said to him, he said, I had a wife and children too.
Yeah, it was a very dark time.
Yeah, but so forgotten. I mean, that's the thing, coming back to this and having, written about it and been steeped in it. It's like, we don't like Trumbo. And then there's the Showtime series about the Lavender Scare.
What was your research process like?
I joke with my graduate students, it's the kind of book that you can only write when you have tenure and you have more time on your hands to really think about and do the research. First of all, I wanted to visit as many archives as I could. Some of these women archived their papers, partly because they understood that, Vera Caspray said, this has been the century of women and I've been a part of it. And so her papers were archived, and I was in Wisconsin at that point in time. So I could access those papers there. And then every time I had a conference, I tried to choose conferences where I could also visit archives. So I would go to a conference, but then I would make sure that the conference was in New York so that I could go to the New York Public Library and look at Gypsy Rose Lee's papers, or go to the Schlesinger at Harvard where I could read Shirley Graham Du Bois's papers. So it was slow and arduous because I wanted to spend a lot of time trying to get to know these women and to hear what had happened to them in their own voices. By the time I got around to settling on this topic, everyone was dead except for Marsha Hunt.
And Marsha Hunt, I'm sorry, I don't recognize.
Marsha Hunt died last year. She was a film actress who had been blacklisted. And she was the only one who was still alive, but she was quite elderly. So the only way for me to get to know them was to read their papers and try to see the world through the lens of their writing and through the lens of what they'd kept, right? What were the things that were there, the photographs, the papers. I found this one paper, it looked like a paper that had been crumpled and then straightened out and crumpled again. It was Vera Caspray's notes about a meeting that she was having with some of the clearance agents. I'm not sure if it was Paramount or not. I think it was Paramount. So that material culture really gave me a sense of who they were. I also realized at a certain point that I wanted to understand why these women were considered a threat by anti-communists.
And I think you did an amazing job explaining that.
Thank you. That was, what I did is some of the women's FBI files were already in the public domain. They'd already been declassified. But for the women whose files weren't declassified, I made Freedom of Information Act requests for each of them. In some cases, I got them. In most cases, they were heavily redacted. And when I went back to the Bureau and asked about the redactions, I was told that they were redacted because of national security. And I'm like, really? Everyone's been dead for 40 years. What? Madeline Guilford was doing baby noises. Like, what do you mean?
Exactly. Oh my goodness. It's just such a wild world, isn't it?
It
just
really is.
For the writers out there, is it hard to get the type of material? You find the address on the internet and you fill out a form.
It's not easy, and it's not just the government's fault. I think that during the previous administration, there was an interest in making sure that people weren't getting access, and they didn't have a lot of people to do this work. And so the queues for responding were quite long. The FBI had this investigation of radio and television that started in 1945 and went on for about 10 years. And I wanted all the files about that investigation. And I'm still waiting. We asked for them in 2016, and we still haven't
Wow.
gotten all of them.
Wow. Do you have to pay for these?
Well, you have to make a case for why you shouldn't have to pay for them. So as a scholar, I could make a case for exceptions, but
Yes.
there were cases where I had to use my own funding to get access to the materials.
Did you get new insight about yourself while writing this book?
Well, since I'm talking to writers, I think we all know that every time we write a new project, you learn things about yourself, you learn things about the way you think, and you learn things about the world. And because I was finishing this up around 2016, 2017, there were a lot of historical resonances that were on my mind. I think that more than teaching me something about myself, this taught me a lot about tenacity and a lot about not giving up, even when you might not live to see the effects of what you're doing, right? Like, I feel like these women fought for principles and for ideals that we're still fighting for today.
Yes.
And that doesn't make their struggles failures or inconsequential. It's incremental work. And I think that was something that sustained me in the writing of this, and in the writing of this during a moment in time where it seemed like the forces of G-man masculinity were prevailing.
Carol, I have enjoyed my time with you. Thank you so much for writing this book. It really has opened up my world. And please keep me posted on anything that's going on with these women and their family. And I would love to attend that symposium if you ever have it, or go to the museum and to continue to talk about the Broadcast 41. They're special, special women, and so are you.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say I worked on this book for a long time, but I also knew that I couldn't tell the story of each of these women. I was telling the story of a generation of women. And so I have been happy all along to share materials. I've shared materials with other writers, with documentary makers. I'm not going to live long enough to write about each of the 41, but if anyone is interested in materials on these women, I'm more than happy to share my research and my resources.
That is so wonderful. Are you on social media? Would you like to give out your social media, or do you have a website?
I have a website, the Broadcast 41 website, and I'm also on the platform formerly known as Twitter at CA Stabile.
Again, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Sandy. It's been such a delight to talk about this with you.
And that's a wrap for the Writers Hangout. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Your positive feedback will help us keep the show going so we can continue bringing you more future episodes. Remember, keep writing. The world needs your stories. The Writers Hangout is sponsored by the Page International Screenwriting Awards, with executive producer Kristen Overn, producers Sandy Adamitis, and myself, Terry Sampson. And our music is composed by Ethan Stoller.